everybody, this is Dr. Maples. Today we're going to talk about method sections in your research papers. Now, a method section is one of the most important sections of any paper because it tells us everything that you're going to do, but it's also a section of the paper that a lot of people really don't give the attention that it deserves. Today what we're going to do is talk a little bit about why we do method sections to begin with. What are the basic things that we're going to find in your everyday run-of-the-mill method section? And also, how might those change based on how we're collecting our data? We've got a lot of ideas to cover, so let's get started. Now, first things first, we have to remember that sociology is a science. We were part of the Age of Enlightenment. We were a product of that period of time in which all this amazing science and knowledge was being created. As part of that, when Auguste Comte was thinking about what sociology might look like, he was also thinking about that Age of Enlightenment, about how work should be peer-reviewed, about how we should all agree on the processes and approaches, and make sure, too, that when someone creates new knowledge, that they created really great new knowledge as opposed to something that's maybe biased or inaccurate. With a method section, we're making sure that everyone who reads your paper understands 100% how you came to find what you came to find at the end of your paper. It makes sure that you use a logical and acceptable way for collecting your data, and that the conclusions that you came up with aren't just random noise. They have reason, rationale, and support. Best part is that a method section is much like a cooking recipe. If I have the recipe and access to the ingredients, I should be able to replicate that recipe. Same thing goes with your method study. If I have your data and I have your methods report, I should be able to come to the exact same findings that you came to. That's why this section is so important. Sociology is a science, and we have to make sure we follow the rules of science. So in the process of doing that, we have to write great method sections. And I want to give you a little bit of pre-thought before we go into what we find in a method section. First off, this is the part of your paper, perhaps more than any part, that deserves a lot of attention. You need to make sure that you're precise, specific, and you tell the reader everything. Remember, the reader can't read your mind. We're not there yet. We might be in the future, but not yet. The reader can't tell what you're thinking about, so we need to know every little thing that you've done. Again, think of this like a recipe. If you tell me how to make chocolate chip cookies and I have access to the same ingredients that you had, I should be able to make identical chocolate chip cookies to you. But if you forget to tell me there's salt or chocolate chips or flour in that recipe, it's going to be something very, very different than what you found. Likewise, too, it's going to be boring. Recipes are boring. There's nothing exciting about them, but that's okay if your methods report is boring. Instead, just make sure it's detailed. One quick note. These and all of your papers, this and all your paper parts are written in third person. We don't say I and me, we, things like that. We're going to focus on talking in third person. You can use the term the researcher because every once in a while you're just kind of stuck with a sentence that you can't really say it any other way. So the researcher is just fine. Let's get started on what exactly goes into method sections. Now, the methods report is going to give us 4 more or less basic ideas. First off, it's going to take a moment and restate your questions and your hypothesis so we understand what exactly it is that you're even trying to do in this paper. Next, you're going to tell us about the data. And we're going to really dig into the data because it can vary on if you collected the data or if it's somebody else's data like the Census Bureau. Third, you're going to tell us about your variables. You're going to tell us how they're defined, how they're going to be measured, and how you're creating these variables from the data that you have available. Finally, you're going to give us a very clear sense of how you're going to analyze this data in the next section. That's sometimes called the analysis section. In other disciplines, it's called the conclusions. There's lots of other ones. But in this next section after this one where you actually analyze the data, you're going to tell us here how you're going to do that. So again, it's a recipe. You're going to tell us step by step how we're making chocolate chip cookies, or in this case, sociological research, which hopefully tastes just as great as chocolate chip cookies. Anyways, first and foremost, I like to start a method section by restating my questions and my hypotheses. At this point, you've probably already listed those somewhere in your paper, whether it's in your lit review, maybe in relation to your theory, or even in your introduction. But this is a great spot to put everything just clearly and state it again, even if you've already done it. And what I like to do is be very formal about it. I like to say exactly what my research question or questions would be. And also for my hypotheses, I like to be very formal about those and state a clear hypothesis. Now remember, if you need help writing a hypothesis, I've got another video up already about that. Same thing for research questions to help you develop those. But with a hypothesis, being very formal about it, I like to number my hypotheses, H1, H2, and so forth. And also, I like to make sure that I state them alongside a null hypothesis, so the researchers, or the readers, understand exactly what I'm thinking about. Let's see a cool example of that. And in fact, we'll even pull something from a paper that I'm working on right now as I work on this lecture. So in this particular study, I'm measuring leave no trace principles, and I'm trying to understand what kinds of things might change this leave no trace measure that I have. We'll talk a little bit more about that measure a little later in this section. But for now, that gives you the basic idea. Particularly, I'm interested that if we attend a training workshop on leave no trace principles, will that help me maybe score better on this leave no trace and inventory measure? So my hypothesis clearly stated. Notice that it's numbered, it's very clear, it's got the colon there to split it up, and also notice the HA underneath it. That's my alternative or null hypothesis. The first one states a clear relationship. Note that it's not a question, it's a statement of fact. I think this is the relationship that we'll find based on the literature review. And the alternative, or null, here notes that there's no relationship to be found. This is a simple example. Now, you'll probably write more in your methods section, but these are some basic sentences that are probably going to be part of that. Next thing, we want to talk about our data. Data are exciting, data are cool, data are an important part of what we need to know about your paper. Data are also plural, by the way. So we need to know how you got your data. Where was it collected? When was it collected? Who collected it? Where does it come from? There's two different kinds of data out there. There's primary data, that's data that you collected, and there's secondary data. That's data that anybody else but you collected, and they're letting you use it in some form. So primary data you collected, secondary data somebody else collected it. Based on which kind of study you're doing, we're going to respond a little differently here. So let's look at these two examples. Let's actually start by looking at primary data, data that you collected. If you collected the data, first off, you probably know more about that data set than anybody else. So you're also going to be able to tell us a lot more about it. In fact, because it's not a data set that anyone else is probably going to know anything about, we need to be very, very specific. I need to know exactly where the data are coming from, how they were collected, who you collected them from, what kind of data were collected, and more. Likewise, if you're thinking about sampling here, you should also write about your sampling approach. You should write about anything that you know about the population you're studying and more. Your focus here is really going to be on the instrument, the survey, for example, the interview, for example. These are how you collected your data. But you're also going to need to tell us a lot of other important information, like who did you study in this? Who were you collecting your data from? When did you collect it? Even if it's just what year you collected it. I like to be really specific and tell you the months that I collected the survey data in my cases and interviews. Also telling us where you collected it. There's all sorts of important little pieces that you'll write in a nice little paragraph in your methods sections if you collected the data to tell everybody else how you got the data. Now, I collect a lot of my own data because there's just not data available for the questions that I want to research. So a good example of this could actually be from a study I did back in 2018 in the New River Gorge. There, we had a survey. It included questions on Leave No Trace workshop participation and also this really cool 28-item Leave No Trace climbing measure that I've been working on for a couple of years. And that climbing measure looks at, on each of these items, about how people might respond to doing a certain activity and if it's appropriate or not appropriate. Again, we'll talk more about that in just a moment when we talk about our variables. Now, I would share that the survey was released by the Access Fund mailing list in May of that year through September of that year, and 274 persons responded to the survey. I'd also point out my sampling here. This is a convenience sample because we don't really know how many people are in this population, and it's best described as a convenience sample. That's all the data that you really need to know from primary. I've covered the who, what, whens, wheres, whys, and hows, so to speak. Maybe not the hows aren't so much part of that, but everything else is. Now, secondary data, unlike primary data, is actually pretty easy. With secondary data, it can be a couple of sentences, even in some cases, one sentence. You're really just going to tell us some important basic information like where your data came from, because you didn't collect it, what year it came from, and any other pertinent information you think that's necessary. Now let's pretend that you were using my data set from the New River Gorge study. You might write something like, data from this study come from a 2018 survey of climbers in West Virginia's New River Gorge. And then you cited the source of that data, my study that I published on it. Now, again, here you're just going to talk about where the data come from. You're also going to give us a sense too of what maybe you're using from that data, thinking ahead to our variable section next, and give us a clue about what you're pulling out of that data. Now, a really good example of secondary data would be something like the Census Bureau, American Community Survey data, Fact Finder data, the GSS, and more. You're simply going to tell us the name of the data source, where it came from, which may be the name of the data source, the year that it comes from, and also give us a sense of what variables that you're going to be working with from that data set. So we can understand that if we needed to replicate it, we could go into that same raw data set and again pull out those same variables. Speaking of variables, variables are an important part, but we're going to talk about those in a minute. Let's pretend that you were doing a secondary data study where you were using someone else's more qualitative data, maybe like some interviews where you wanted to do like a content analysis of the interviews, or YouTube videos and you wanted to do a content analysis of that. Again, you could simply list the source, the year, the place. You could talk about how many surveys or interviews or whatever were in this thing that you're studying, how many videos you're studying. And then you're going to explain too a little bit about the variables that you're pulling out from that data source. Again, you're just giving us the information so that if we needed to do this ourselves, we could. Now, on variables, this is probably the most important part of other people understanding what you're doing in a paper, because I've had so many studies that I've read where I get through the method section and it's like, okay, that's your data, got it, that's your questions, and then they just don't talk about their variables. So I'm have to kind of guess as to what variables they're really studying. So make sure to take some time on this. When we list our variables, we're going to tell the people the very variables that we're going to mess with at all in this paper. And here's a hint. If you don't use that variable at all in your paper, you don't bring it up. If it's not used somewhere in this paper, you don't talk about it. Because remember, there's tons and tons of questions on the census, but you're not maybe working with all of them. You might be working with 2 or 3. So only talk about the variables you're going to use. And for those variables, you're going to do 2 important things. You're going to tell us how you define them and how you measure them. Or in fancy scientific words, you're going to tell us how you conceptualize your variable or define it, and how you operationalize your variable or you measured it. You're going to also explain how your variables link back into your hypotheses. Can I give you an inside hint here? Don't tell anybody. But if you do a really clear, clean job on these variables, it's actually going to make things easier for you down the line in this paper, because you're going to know exactly what you're really trying to do in the paper. By the way, if you recoded any of the data, if you changed the data, if you excluded cases, this is also where you gotta let us know. It's kind of like leaving salt out of the recipe or not saying how much salt you use in a recipe. Same thing here. We've got to know every little piece of your recipe. Let's see an example of that. And let's go back to my leave no trace study that we've been talking about so far. So I pulled out a variable called leave no trace workplace participation from my data set. And this variable is my independent variable. That means that this is one that I'm going to manipulate changes to see if it changes something else. And here I define L&T workshops as a very formal, organized event scheduled by representatives from a specific organization designed to train people on how to basically minimize your impact. My survey could ask a person if they've in the last year participated in an L&T workshop. If they have, then I mark it a yes. If they have not, then I mark it a no. And when I get into my actual analysis, this is where I would want to explain how I'm going to measure this. I'm going to point out that I recode the data of yes and no to be either a 0 and a 1. What kind of variable is that? It's a dichotomous dummy. You hear me say that all the time, but that's a great variable for using things like t-tests and even in some kinds of regression. So when we do a dichotomous dummy variable, we code a 0, it means the absence of the trait, 1 means the presence of the trait. So in this case, a 1 means they went to the L&T workshop, and a 0 means they didn't, because maybe they were getting pizza or something that day. I don't know. Maybe they were busy. But they should have gone because it's a great thing, but they didn't. It's okay. We're not gonna dwell on that, Dr. Maples, whatsoever. And that's it. We've gone through, we have conceptualized our variable, we defined it, and we've now operationalized it. We said how we're going to measure it. We even pointed out some changes that we made to it in recoding it. So now everybody in this paper knows exactly how I used that variable. Finally, last thing you do is you got to tell us what you're going to do with all these variables and questions and hypotheses and data set. The analytical approach is this last little section of the paper that tells us how you're going to work with the data. Now, I do want to point out, don't get the analytical approach part of your methods report mixed up with what sociologists would call the analysis section. The analysis section actually is what comes next, and that's what our next lecture video is going to be about too. That's where we actually do the things that we say we're doing in the methods report. So here, we're not analyzing any data. We're just telling people, oh, and by the way, this is how I'm going to do it. This is kind of like telling people what temperature to cook their cookies at for the recipe, right? We keep using that example. So now I know how I'm going to cook the cookies in the same way that I know how you're going to analyze the cookies or data variables. Anyways, so make sure you don't get that confused. Here, we're going to set some very clear processes about how we're going to test our hypotheses that we've been discussing in this section. Now, to give you an example of this, again, we can go back to my Leave No Trace paper. In this study, the researcher's third person, will examine how participating in a Leave No Trace workshop, which is my independent variable, might influence outcomes of the study's previously described Leave No Trace knowledge measure, which, by the way, that's a 28-item survey that I can build into a scale. I'd be happy to talk about that anytime. This particular variable would be my dependent variable because I think there's going to be a change in this based on whether or not you went to a workshop or not. Think about it this way. If you went to the workshop, you probably learned more about Leave No Trace. So if I give you a test on it, you should do better on it than people who didn't study, right? There you go. That's what we're trying to do. And here in this example, we're going to use t-testing, the good old-fashioned student t. We're going to see what happens here if the means vary for this dependent variable, our Leave No Trace knowledge measure, and we're going to see if it varies based on whether or not someone participated in this Leave No Trace workshop. Again, my hypothesis says if you participate in the workshop, you should do better on the measure than people who didn't participate in the workshop. If you studied for the exam, you should do better on the exam than people that didn't. So there you go. That's a nice, straightforward example. Let's do a more qualitative example for students who might be doing qualitative data, because I love quantitative data. I know I'm a quantoid, but qualitative data is cool too. I've written a book using it. Using oral history data as an example, we could maybe go back and do some coding of themes that are talked about in interviews. So let's pretend in this study that I'm going to use an oral history collection that I collected, and we're going to go back and try to understand how climbers describe their interactions with residents, which is a dependent variable for us. And then we're going to see if they began climbing indoors, outdoors, or both at the same time. And we're going to use this as 3 independent variables. And we're going to see how each of these link up with how people describe their interactions, whether they're good, bad, or somewhere in between. And in here, I'm maybe not going to do statistical testing because I don't have a lot of those oral history interviews. So maybe I'm just going to do a crosstab and try and look for relationships. Do we find that people who started climbing outdoors have stronger relationships with people in the local community? Maybe we'll find people who started climbing in gyms are far more interested in getting to know local people. We don't know. But these are all good examples of how we might do an analysis of some really cool oral history data. Now, let's wrap things up. And I got to repeat this. The method section, don't tell anybody. It's probably going to be boring. I mean, like boring, like documentary on something that you're not interested in learning about, kind of boring. And that's okay. Because really all you're trying to do is make sure that the people who are going to read your study know exactly what you're doing. It's the same reasoning that for most of us, reading a cooking recipe is probably not all that exciting. What I want you to do, even though it's boring, is don't worry about trying to make it exciting. Instead, spend time getting into the details of it. I like to say geek out on the details of it and go really in depth on trying to explain every little thing that you can about this. You can always write more than you need to, and believe me, I do that most of the time when I'm doing a methods report. I tell people a lot more than's actually needed, and some of it ends up on the cutting room floor. And that's a good thing, because it's better to have too much information than not enough. Focus on being very clear, straight to the point, short sentences. If you got a really, really long sentence, split it up. Break your ideas into smaller pieces. Make sure you stay third person throughout. No more I's and me's in your professional writing. If you're doing a sociological study, it's going to be in third person. Finally, I can't stress it enough, and gosh, I'm getting hungry thinking about it, but pretend you're cooking when you make your methods report. Pretend every step of the way that you're trying to tell your friend over Zoom or over the phone how to replicate your study or to cook a recipe. Tell them every little step, because we can't read your mind and we can't even understand the things that you might be thinking about. So we need to know every little step. That's why your methods report should be super precise. And this is very important. If you change something in the data, if you exclude cases, if you have to recode cases, tell us how you did that too. Because if you changed it, we need to know. If you converted from teaspoons to some other measure, we need to know about that. The more detail that you can put into a methods report, the better. And I'm here to tell you, if you can write for your paper a clear methods report, it's going to show in the quality of your paper's analysis and findings, because you're going to understand far more clearly what your paper was really trying to do. And that's going to set you up for success in the coming sections. Now, in the coming weeks, we're going to have some other videos available to talk about these other parts of the paper, but that's it for now. If you have questions about your methods section, making sure that it's in line with what Auguste Comte was trying to do with the Age of Enlightenment, if you're not sure if your methods section is doing what it needs to, just get in touch with me. I'm happy to chat about that. But don't forget, a clear method section is 100% going to support you being successful in the rest of your paper. If you have questions, you know where to find me. Otherwise, I will see you in the next lecture. Take care, y'all.